Millionaire CEO saw his humble employee helping the homeless, then made a shocking proposal. He saw her again tonight. Same corner, same thin coat, same soft smile. While the rest of the world rushed by in luxury cars and warm coats, she knelt on the freezing sidewalk, gently handing a sandwich to a man who had nothing left. From his towering office window, Logan Miller, billionaire, cold, untouchable, couldn't look away. Night after night she came, quiet, humble, giving, and for reasons he couldn't explain, reasons that scared him. This fragile woman, living on pennies, was slowly unraveling the emptiness he had spent his whole life building. Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones with nothing to lose, except their hearts. The city of Chicago pulsed beneath the endless glass towers, cold and indifferent, as though it barely noticed the millions of souls weaving through its veins each day. For most, it was a place of ambition. A city where power hummed behind marble lobbies and gleaming black town cars. But for Emily Carter, it was simply survival. She tightened her scarf as the wind sliced between the skyscrapers, tugging at the hem of her thin coat. The February air bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her gloved hands held 2 plastic bags filled with juice boxes, granola bars, and discounted loaves of bread. The same routine she followed every evening after work. Miller Enterprises towered behind her, its steel and glass catching the last hints of daylight like a mirror reflecting a world she would never belong to. At least not the way most people here did. Her breath clouded the air as she crossed to the small corner where they always waited: Marvin, Ellen, Paul, and a few others. They smiled when they saw her, their faces worn but always kind. "Evening, Miss Emily," Marvin greeted, his voice raspy but warm. His old coat barely clung to his thin frame, the stitching fraying at the sleeves. "We were hoping you'd come." Emily smiled softly as she knelt beside him, pulling food from her bags. "Of course I came. Granola bars tonight, and juice. I managed to grab some extra blankets, too." A soft wave of laughter rippled through the group as hands reached for the small offering. To anyone else it was nothing, but to them it was everything. As she handed out the last sandwich, Emily felt that familiar warmth bloom in her chest, not from pride, but from knowing she could give a small piece of dignity back to people the world had forgotten. But tonight, like many nights before, she was not as alone as she thought. High above, on the 35th floor of Miller Enterprises, Logan Miller stood behind the glass wall of his office, his sharp gaze fixed on the scene below. He had seen her. Every night, quiet, consistent, predictable, yet completely unlike anyone else. At first it was curiosity, then frustration. Now he wasn't sure. What could possibly drive someone like her, earning barely enough to survive herself, to spend what little she had on strangers? Logan Miller was not a man easily rattled. His world was built on logic, precision, control. He had turned Miller Enterprises into a global empire before his 35th birthday, his name synonymous with power and ruthless efficiency. Yet here he stood, night after night, watching a junior assistant from his own finance department kneel in the freezing cold for people who had nothing to offer her. His jaw tightened. What does she get out of this, Mr. Miller? The voice behind him belonged to his assistant, Marissa, polite and carefully distant, like everyone else who worked for him. He turned only slightly. "I'll be leaving shortly. Reschedule the Tokyo call for tomorrow." "Yes, sir." As the office fell silent again, Logan's eyes drifted back to the scene below. To Emily Carter's soft smile as she hugged an old woman wrapped in a threadbare blanket. No cameras, no audience, just kindness. He exhaled slowly and finally turned away from the window, but her image lingered. The next morning, Emily arrived at work as usual, 7:45 sharp. Blending into the sea of interns, analysts, and executives filling the lobby, she rode the elevator in silence, clutching her worn leather bag like a small shield against the world. At her tiny desk, buried in reports and spreadsheets, she buried herself in numbers, carefully triple-checking financial records that would never bear her name. "Emily Carter," a voice said suddenly. She looked up, startled, and nearly lost her breath. Logan Miller stood at her desk. In person, His presence was nothing like the casual suits she saw in passing executives. Logan carried himself with an authority that swallowed the air around him, tall, perfectly tailored, and coldly observant. "Yes, Mr. Miller," she managed, standing up far too quickly. "How long have you been with us?" he asked, his voice low, precise. 3 months, sir," she swallowed, praying her voice didn't betray her nerves. "You like it here?" The question caught her off guard. What did he want from her? Was this a test? "I do," she said carefully. "It's challenging. I'm learning a lot." He studied her for a beat too long, his gaze unsettling but not cruel. Then he gave a slight nod. "Good," he said simply, and then, like a shadow passing through sunlight, he turned and walked away. Emily sat down slowly, her heart pounding. What had that been? A warning? A compliment? A mistake? She tried to refocus on her reports, but her mind spun wildly. Why had the CEO of the entire company taken an interest in someone like her? That evening, like always, she bought the food. She handed out the sandwiches. She knelt on the same cold sidewalk. But tonight, Logan Miller wasn't behind his office window. Tonight, he stood just across the street, watching her from the shadows. Closer than ever before. And this time, for the first time, he whispered to himself words that unsettled him far more than he expected. He shouldn't have to do this alone. Chapter 1: Shadows on the Sidewalk. The city never really slept. It only dimmed slightly, like the flickering of tired eyes before morning dragged them open again. Emily Carter pulled her coat tighter as she hurried down Wabash Avenue, her breath forming thin clouds that disappeared into the icy February night. The bags in her arms bounced lightly against her sides, paper sacks from the corner market filled with small comforts, peanut butter crackers, juice boxes, granola bars, and simple sandwiches she had made the night before. She could have gone straight home. Should have. Rent was due in 6 days. Her electric bill had already sent its second notice. And the shoes she wore, black flats she'd once bought secondhand, had begun to split at the sole. But she didn't turn toward home. Instead, like she had done every night for the past 7 months, she made her way to the small group gathered near the north entrance of Miller Enterprises. They were already waiting. "Emily!" Marvin called out, his voice thin but cheerful. The old man sat on an upturned crate, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with something steaming, probably from the church shelter nearby. "Evening, everyone," she greeted, kneeling beside him as the others slowly gathered. The faces around her were familiar now. Ellen, who always smiled through chattering teeth even though her blanket was far too thin. Paul, barely 23, with sad, restless eyes that hinted at a life derailed too soon. A few others drifted in, some silent, some smiling, all grateful. Emily began handing out the sandwiches first, speaking softly as she moved. "Marvin, I got you the whole grain ones you like. Ellen, there's apple juice tonight. I know that's your favorite." "You are an angel," Ellen whispered, her voice cracking. Emily smiled, but it was small, almost apologetic. "I'm just doing what I can." The food passed from hand to hand like small treasures. The world outside this tiny circle went on indifferent. Sleek cars sped past. Polished shoes clacked against the pavement. Suits and coats avoided eye contact as they hurried toward warm apartments, fine dinners, and lives untouched by hunger. And high above them all, rising like a crystal tower into the clouds, loomed Miller Enterprises, her employer, her daily world of spreadsheets and numbers. She glanced up at it, not knowing that tonight, for the first time, its most powerful occupant wasn't standing behind the glass, but standing across the street. Hidden in the deep shadow of a marble column, Logan Miller watched silently. This close, he could see details his office window never revealed. The frayed edges of her scarf, the tiny patch sewn into the elbow of her coat, the way her breath quickened slightly when she knelt to pass food to Marvin. She didn't hesitate. She didn't rush. She stayed, speaking to them as if they were old friends rather than forgotten shadows of the city. He watched the way her hands moved, careful, kind, deliberate. For reasons he still didn't fully understand, he hadn't been able to stop watching her for months. Logan Miller was used to understanding people, predicting them. He had built an empire on reading the motivations behind every handshake, every glance across a boardroom table. Everyone wanted something: recognition, money, status. But this woman, she confused him. He had already run the basic background check. Emily Carter, 25, junior finance assistant, graduated community college, no family listed in the city, paid rent on time, worked overtime often, salary just enough to scrape by. And yet she spent her nights here. Why? Why did someone who had so little give so much? It wasn't strategy, it wasn't charity for credit, there were no cameras, no social media posts, no fundraisers. Just quiet, nightly acts of care. And that made him deeply, irrationally uncomfortable. He shifted slightly in the shadow, exhaling slowly. "You're not supposed to exist," he murmured to himself. The wind kicked up, catching a few strands of her hair as she laughed softly with Marvin. She gently adjusted Ellen's scarf, tucking it higher around the woman's thin neck, as if it might protect her from a winter that could swallow them all. For the first time in years, Logan Miller realized that his mind, which normally ticked with deals, negotiations, and quarterly reports, was occupied by something it couldn't quantify. "So, you shouldn't have to do this alone," he thought again. But the words remained locked inside him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his trance. He glanced at the screen. Another email, another deal waiting for his approval. But for once, he didn't respond. He stayed for another moment, his gaze fixed on her like a man peering into a life he could never imagine for himself. A life built on something he had long abandoned. Compassion without condition. Finally, as the cold began to seep through even his tailored wool coat, Logan turned and walked away, disappearing back into the glittering streets. But her face stayed with him. And for the first time in years, Logan Miller, who had everything, felt like he might be missing something far more important than power. That night, as Emily walked home, her pockets empty again, but her heart strangely full, she had no idea that her life had just shifted. Not because of anything she had done differently, but because someone was finally watching. And this time, he wouldn't be able to walk away. Chapter 2. The CEO's first move. The hum of the office was constant but distant, like the background noise of a machine too large to notice the people inside it. Emily Carter sat at her desk on the 24th floor of Miller Enterprises, eyes focused on the spreadsheet glowing in front of her. Rows of numbers danced across the screen, the columns blurring slightly as she checked and rechecked her formulas for the third time. Mistakes weren't an option. Not here. Not when she had finally carved out a fragile space for herself in this towering machine. Her desk was small, tucked neatly into a row of identical cubicles. No windows, no view, just fluorescent lights, buzzing computers, and the endless clicking of keyboards. Around her, co-workers murmured in quiet tones, filing reports, preparing quarterly summaries, and answering emails with a rehearsed sense of urgency. She didn't mind the work. In fact, she was grateful for it. This job, this paycheck, was the reason she could keep paying rent, keep helping Marvin and Ellen, and keep pretending she was one misstep away from everything crashing down. "Emily!" her supervisor's voice called from behind her. She spun slightly in her chair. "Yes, Mr. Gaines?" He handed her a stack of files. "Review these for inconsistencies and rerun the variance reports before the end of the day." "Of course," she nodded, pulling the files onto her desk. She didn't even flinch at the short deadline anymore. As her fingers moved across the keyboard, she allowed her mind, just for a moment, to drift. She thought of last night, of Marvin's tired smile, of Ellen's grateful hug, of Paul's stubborn insistence that one day he'd find a job and leave that sidewalk behind. And then, without warning, her computer screen went dark, swallowed by a tall shadow. Her heart jumped. She looked up. Logan Miller. In person, the billionaire CEO of the entire company was standing at her desk, hands tucked casually into his pockets, but his presence was anything but casual. For a second, her brain couldn't catch up. She stood so quickly, her chair bumped the edge of her desk. "Mr. Miller," she stammered, her voice soft, breath tight. He studied her face, those sharp gray eyes narrowing slightly, as though assessing something more than her performance. She could feel her pulse pounding behind her ears. "Emily Carter," he repeated softly. as if testing her name on his tongue. "Yes, sir." 3 months, correct? "Yes, sir." She cleared her throat, trying not to sound as nervous as she felt. "I've been in the finance department since November." There was a brief silence, long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. She searched his face for any hint of expression, but found only cool calculation. Not harsh, not kind, simply unreadable. "How are you finding the work?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. It was such an ordinary question, painfully ordinary, but coming from him, it felt like a loaded test. "It's challenging," she answered carefully, choosing her words. "But I'm learning a great deal. I'm very grateful for the opportunity." A faint flicker crossed his face, a brief narrowing of the eyes, as though something about her answer both puzzled and amused him. "Grateful?" he echoed softly. Then, after a long beat, "Good. We value employees who know how to persevere." His words felt strange. Not unfriendly, but distant, like a chess master commenting on a pawn still standing halfway across the board. "Keep up the work," he added, already starting to turn. And just like that, it was over. Logan Miller, the man who hadn't spoken a word to her in 3 months, had sought her out, asked a single question, and vanished as quickly as he appeared. She sat back down, her fingers lightly trembling over the keyboard. She could feel the curious glances of her coworkers, heads subtly turned, eyes flickering toward her desk before quickly looking away. Why was the CEO suddenly interested in a junior assistant? Maybe he was just being polite, she tried to tell herself. Maybe it meant nothing. But as her mind raced, she couldn't shake the uneasy flutter twisting in her stomach. High above her, back in the privacy of his corner office, Logan Miller sat at his desk, staring through the glass wall that framed the city like a moving painting. He replayed their brief encounter in his mind. There was something about her voice, steady, even when she was clearly nervous, and the way she'd said she was grateful, like she truly meant it. It unsettled him. Grateful employees were rare. Employees who spent every night handing out food to strangers in the freezing cold? Even rarer. He leaned back, fingers interlaced beneath his chin, staring out at the world he'd built. It was made of sharp edges, brutal negotiations, power plays. A world where sincerity was either a tactic or a weakness. But Emily Carter didn't fit that world. And that's precisely why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Later that evening, as Emily left work and followed her usual path toward the corner market, she tried not to think about his voice, about how effortlessly he had made her feel small and noticed at the same time. She picked up the familiar items, the bread, the juice, the granola bars. Her wallet was thinner than usual. Payday was still days away. She hesitated for a moment, calculating how much she could spare, and then added a few extra sandwiches anyway. As she stepped back into the cold night, she didn't know that Logan Miller, now standing at the entrance of the building, had paused again to watch her. Not from the distance of his office window this time. This time he was much closer. Close enough to see her hand out every meal. Close enough to hear the warmth in her voice as she knelt down to speak with Marvin. Close enough to feel something unfamiliar stir inside him, a tightness in his chest that no boardroom victory had ever given him. And as his black car pulled up beside him, he stood for a moment longer before finally stepping inside. "Home, sir?" his driver asked. Logan stared at the reflection of Emily in the side mirror as the car pulled away. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." Chapter 3. A ride she couldn't refuse. The storm had come out of nowhere, a cold, relentless rain, pounding the city streets like tiny shards of glass. Emily tightened her scarf and ducked her head, the soaked fabric clinging to her neck as she quickened her steps across Wabash Avenue. The plastic bags in her hand grew heavier with each block, the cheap paper handles already beginning to dissolve beneath the weight of wet air. She hadn't planned to buy so much tonight. She couldn't afford it. But when Marvin had quietly mentioned Ellen's worn-out blanket and Paul's thin sneakers, she couldn't bring herself to do less. Not tonight. The money would run out. Again. But she didn't care. Not in this moment. What mattered was that for one more night, someone wouldn't be cold. Someone would eat. She crossed the street, her shoes slipping slightly on the slick pavement as headlights flashed past her. The towering frame of Miller Enterprises stood ahead, the glass glistening under the streetlights like some distant castle. Untouchable, cold, indifferent. The irony of it always stung. She spent her days inside that tower and her nights outside its shadow, kneeling on the wet pavement, trying to give strangers what no one had ever given her: kindness without condition. By the time she reached the familiar corner, they were already waiting. "Emily," Marvin called softly from beneath the thin awning of a boarded storefront. His beard was damp and his hands trembled slightly as he pulled the old coat tighter around himself. "You didn't have to come out in this." "I always come," she said, her breath fogging between them. "Rain or not." The others gathered quickly, soft murmurs of gratitude as she passed out the food. Wet hands clutched juice boxes. Thin fingers wrapped gratefully around packaged sandwiches. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But they smiled anyway, as though it was everything. The rain only fell harder, soaking through her coat and dampening her hair as she knelt to tuck the extra blanket around Ellen's frail shoulders. "You're going to catch your death out here," Ellen whispered, patting Emily's hand. "You shouldn't be doing this alone." Emily smiled softly. "Neither should you." She stayed longer than she should have, listening to them talk, laughing softly at their small jokes, as if, for a few minutes, the cold didn't exist. And all the while, she never noticed the sleek black car parked just across the street. Inside the vehicle, Logan Miller sat motionless, his sharp gaze never leaving her. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction that didn't come. For days now, Logan had watched from afar, observing her ritual without interfering. But tonight, as the rain poured harder, something inside him twisted. It was irrational, unnecessary, dangerous. But it was undeniable. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Pull around." "Yes, sir." The car rolled slowly forward, gliding up to the curb just as Emily stood, brushing water from her sleeves, preparing for the long walk home. The window lowered with a quiet mechanical hum. "Miss Carter." She froze. The voice sent a current through her chest before she even turned. Her heart dropped as she faced the man inside. "Mr. Miller," she breathed, rain dripping from her hair, her soaked scarf clinging to her chin. For a moment, neither spoke. She looked as though she had been carved from the night itself, drenched, exhausted, yet somehow steady. "You live far from here?" he asked calmly. She hesitated, unsure if this was a conversation or some strange evaluation. "Yes." He glanced toward the road ahead. "You all walk in this storm?" She pulled the soggy bags tighter against her chest. "I've done worse." Something flickered in his expression, irritation or concern. She couldn't tell. "Get in." Emily blinked. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I can manage." His jaw tightened slightly. "I insist." The word hung heavy between them. Not a command, but not quite a request either. The thought of sitting in his car, in that cocoon of warmth and silence, was almost too surreal to imagine. This was her boss. The man who existed in conference rooms and quarterly reviews. A man whose world she would never belong to. But her legs ached. Her shoes squished miserably beneath her, and for the first time in weeks, the weight of exhaustion pressed hard against her chest. Slowly, she nodded and opened the door. Inside the car, the contrast was immediate. Warm leather seats, soft amber lighting, and the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Emily sat rigid, clutching the bags to her lap as rainwater dripped quietly onto the floor mat. Logan didn't speak at first. He simply drove, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as the city blurred by. For several blocks, only the soft patter of rain filled the space between them. Then, finally, his voice broke the silence. "You spent your entire paycheck on them." She stiffened. "Sir, I saw your bank statement." His voice was calm, almost too calm. It wasn't difficult. Her cheeks flushed with heat. "You looked into my finances?" His eyes remained on the road. "I needed to understand." "You don't need to understand," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Not everyone does things for a return." His hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. "That's what confuses me." She stared out the window, her breath fogging against the glass. Maybe it shouldn't. Another long silence filled the car. Then he spoke again, softer now. And you have no savings left? Not even for rent? She exhaled slowly. I'll figure it out. Logan glanced at her briefly. You shouldn't have to. Her eyes flickered toward him, uncertain, unsettled. Why do you care? For the first time since she'd entered the car, Logan's gaze locked with hers. And when he spoke, it was quieter than she expected, almost vulnerable. Because for the first time in a very long time, I want to. The car pulled gently to a stop outside her small apartment building. She reached for the door handle, suddenly desperate for the safety of her solitude, but his voice stopped her once more. If you continue spending your money like this, he said, at least let me cover your transportation home. She shook her head, a faint, breathless smile tugging at her lips. I've managed this long, Mr. Miller. I'll manage tomorrow, too. He didn't reply. And as she stepped into the rain and closed the door behind her, Logan Miller remained still, watching the space where she had been, wondering why, for the first time in years, it suddenly mattered. Chapter 4. Accused and Abandoned. The storm had long passed, but the air inside Miller Enterprises that morning felt heavier than any rain. Emily sat at her desk, shoulders tense as she sifted through the latest financial reports, her eyes scanning every line with obsessive care. She had always double-checked her numbers, triple-checked. Accuracy was her armor in this towering world of people far more powerful than her. But today, something felt off. When the email first came through, her chest tightened. Subject: Urgent, meeting request. From Director of Finance. Time: 10:30 IMM, Conference Room 3. There was no explanation, no agenda. Just a summons. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reread it. She tried to steady her breathing, whispering quietly to herself. It's nothing, routine, a review, maybe. But even as she told herself that, she knew better. By 10:25, Emily stood in front of the glass-walled conference room, gripping her notepad tightly. Inside, several of the finance department supervisors had already gathered. She recognized them all. Men and women who rarely spoke to her beyond curt emails or brief instructions. At the head of the table sat Director Warren, his sharp eyes flickering toward her when she entered. Emily, take a seat. The door shut behind her with a soft click, sealing her inside the sterile space. The usual office hum seemed distant now, like the quiet before a storm. She sat, carefully folding her hands over her notepad, trying to maintain her composure. Director Warren cleared his throat, voice clipped. We'll get right to the point. He pushed 2 stacks of papers forward across the table. These are the quarterly variance reports you submitted last week, he said. And these, he pointed to the second pile, are the reports reviewed by our internal audit team. Emily leaned forward, scanning the pages. The numbers, they didn't match. Entire columns showed discrepancies. Expenses added where none existed. Revenue misstatements that distorted entire budgets. Her stomach dropped. This, she began, swallowing hard, this isn't my work. Warren's expression remained hard. You're certain? Yes. She forced herself to meet his eyes. I would never submit falsified data. Another supervisor spoke then, his voice like sandpaper. Emily, these reports came directly from your system access, your login credentials, your timestamp. Her head spun. Someone must have... there has to be a mistake, or... The board takes financial manipulation very seriously, Warren interrupted. Whether intentional or negligent, this is an internal control violation. Panic surged in her chest, but she fought to keep her voice level. I didn't do this, she whispered. The words hung in the room like fragile glass, but no one reached to catch them. Warren folded his hands. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Your system access will be revoked and your duties reassigned. Emily's breath caught. Suspended? This is standard procedure, he said coldly, as though that somehow made it merciful. She opened her mouth to protest, but found nothing left to say. The walls seemed to close in tighter. The floor shifted beneath her chair. And just like that, everything she had fought to build, the job, the fragile stability, unraveled in a single breath. You may gather your belongings now. The walk back to her desk felt longer than every late-night trip through the city combined. Eyes followed her, curious stares from coworkers who never spoke to her but now suddenly noticed her every step. The rumor mill had already started to churn. By the time she reached her desk, her vision blurred. Her fingers shook as she packed her few belongings into a small box. A framed photo of her mother's old house, the worn notebook filled with budgeting notes, the ceramic mug one of the homeless women had given her on. The elevator ride down felt endless. And when the doors opened to the lobby, she felt like the building itself was spitting her out. "Emily." The voice cut through the fog the moment she stepped outside. "Logan." He stood near the curb, his black town car idling behind him. She froze. His gaze moved across her face, reading every line, every tremble in her hands, every fracture beneath her forced calm. "You've heard," she whispered. His jaw clenched. "Yes." "I didn't do it," she said, her voice breaking as tears threatened to rise. "I would never risk—" "I know." The two words stopped her cold. He believed her. Logan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tell me who handled your reports." She blinked, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Warren and one of the senior supervisors, Mark Preston." Logan's face darkened. Her voice quavered. "But there's no proof, and now I have no job." "You will," he said quietly. "Trust me." "You can't get involved," she said, her voice tight with fear. "This could cost you." He exhaled sharply, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you honestly believe I care about that?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to believe him, desperately. But hope was a dangerous thing. Logan reached for her hand, not forcefully, but with an unfamiliar softness. His voice dropped lower, firm but tender. "Don't go far, Emily." And for the first time since her world had begun to crumble, she felt something steady beneath her feet. Someone was standing beside her. Over the next 2 days, Emily stayed home. Her small apartment felt tighter than usual, as if the walls themselves could sense her failure. She barely slept. She barely ate. Her phone buzzed with messages from coworkers, none of them offering comfort, only veiled curiosity. But every time doubt tried to pull her under, she remembered his words. "Don't go far." On the third morning, her phone lit up. Her unknown number. She hesitated, heart hammering in her chest, then answered. "Emily." His voice. "Logan." "I found something," he said calmly. "Be at my office, 10 sharp." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hands shaking as she whispered to herself. "Don't fall apart now." Chapter 5. The CEO's Quiet Rescue. The elevator doors opened on the 35th floor with a soft chime that sounded far too gentle for how fast Emily's heart was pounding. Everything felt heavier this morning. Her coat, her breath, her fear. She hadn't stepped foot in this building since they suspended her, and every fiber in her body screamed to turn back. But Logan's voice still echoed in her head. "Be at my office, 10 sharp." The executive assistant outside his office barely looked up as Emily approached, simply nodding toward the door. "He's waiting for you." Emily exhaled and pushed the door open. The office was silent. The city stretched out behind Logan Miller like a painting, cold, majestic, distant. But Logan didn't look at the view. He was already standing, arms crossed, eyes locked on her the moment she stepped inside. "Close the door." The weight of his voice made her chest tighten. She obeyed, the soft click of the door behind her sounding like the ceiling of a vault. "Sit," he said gently. She sat across from his massive desk, clutching her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. She tried to read his face, but as always, Logan's expression was unreadable, all sharp angles and controlled stillness. And then slowly he slid a thick file across the desk toward her. "Open it." With trembling hands, Emily flipped the folder open. Her breath caught. Inside were printed copies of access logs, time-stamped system entries, and most damning of all, side-by-side versions of the altered reports compared to her original files. Her voice cracked. Logan spoke softly. "Mark Preston altered your files after you submitted them." She stared down at the documents, her vision blurring. "But how? My login?" "He used your credentials through an administrative override." His jaw tightened as he explained. like the very words disgusted him. "I traced the override through IT. He accessed your files from a proxy server tied to Warren's department." Her stomach twisted. "Warren." Logan nodded once. It was deliberate. Emily pressed a shaking hand over her mouth. The weight of the betrayal hit her like a fist to the chest. "They tried to frame me," she whispered. "Yes," Logan said. His voice was calm, but beneath it was something harder. Steel. Anger. The kind of cold fury that only men like him could wield so quietly. "And now what?" she whispered. "They've already suspended me. Everyone thinks They won't for much longer." Logan's eyes sharpened, his voice lowering into something darker. "This morning, I met with the board. I presented them with this." He tapped the folder lightly. "Warren and Preston have both been placed on immediate leave, pending termination. Legal has already drafted charges for breach of company policy, internal fraud, and ethics violations." Emily blinked, struggling to catch up. "You did all this? For me?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, quietly, like it was something he wasn't used to admitting, "Yeah." The words sat between them, weighty and impossible to ignore. "I couldn't allow them to destroy you," he continued, his voice softer now, less CEO, more man. "Not when you've done nothing but work with integrity every single day. Not when you've sacrificed so much for others." Tears stung her eyes, but she fought to keep them from falling. "Mr. Miller." "Logan," he corrected gently. "Just Logan." Her breath hitched. The way he said her name, the way his voice softened, it cracked something inside her. "You didn't have to do this. I know." "Why did you?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper. And this time, he didn't dodge the question. "I've told you before, Emily, because for the first time, I want to." Their eyes locked. The distance between them, though only a desk, suddenly felt so much smaller. "You're not alone anymore," he added softly. The tears finally broke free, sliding quietly down her cheeks. "I didn't think anyone would fight for me," she admitted, her voice shaking. "You don't need to fight alone," he said, "not anymore." For a long moment they sat in silence, two people from entirely different worlds, but bound now by something neither fully understood yet. Trust. And something else that neither dared name yet. When Emily finally left his office, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The weight wasn't gone entirely, but someone was now standing beneath it with her. The rumors swirled fast through the office, as rumors always do. Heads turned when she passed. Whispers flitted behind coffee cups and hastily closed office doors. But this time, she didn't bow her head. Because this time, Logan Miller had made sure the truth was louder than the gossip. That evening, as she left the building for the first time with her badge fully reinstated, Emily paused briefly on the sidewalk. She glanced up at the tower, and high above, behind the vast windows, she knew he was likely watching. She smiled softly into the cold wind. And somewhere in the distance, Logan Miller, standing once again at his window, found himself smiling too. Chapter 6. The Dinner That Changed Everything. The invitation arrived not as an email or formal request, but as a simple message flashing on her work phone late Friday afternoon. From Logan Miller. Subject: Dinner. Message: 8 p.m., Madison Room. "I'll send a car." Emily stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Not a meeting, not a briefing, not another tense office encounter where words were measured and distance carefully maintained. Dinner. The two-syllable word echoed through her chest, louder than it should have. By 7:55, she found herself standing in the warm glow of the Madison Room, one of Chicago's most exclusive private restaurants. Entirely out of place, the polished marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars. Waiters in tailored black suits moved quietly through the dimly lit space, speaking in soft tones. She had borrowed the only suitable dress she owned, a simple black sheath that barely clung to the formality of this world. She had almost canceled, twice, but curiosity, and something else far more dangerous, had pulled her here. The maitre d' led her to a private corner booth, where Logan Miller was already waiting. He stood when she approached, ever the gentleman beneath his controlled exterior. His dark suit fit him like it had been stitched to his frame, the soft gray of his tie a rare warmth against his usually cold demeanor. "Emily," he said softly, offering his hand to steady her as she sat. The touch of his fingertips against hers sent a quiet shiver through her. "Mr. Miller," she replied out of habit, before correcting herself with a shy smile. "Logan." He allowed a faint smile to pull at the corner of his lips. Not the calculating one he wore in boardrooms, but something different. Lighter. Real. They ordered, or rather, he did, and as the waiter slipped away, they were left with nothing but silence between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of unspoken questions filled the air. Why are we here? What is this? What happens now? Finally, Logan broke the quiet. "You've been back for almost 2 weeks now?" Emily nodded softly. "Yes." "You've been steady, focused." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But distant." She lowered her gaze for a moment. "I wasn't sure where I stood." His voice softened. "You stood exactly where you always have, stronger than you know." Her breath caught, the quiet compliment unexpected, almost intimate. "I wasn't sure you still wanted me working there, after everything. I've never questioned your value to this company." He paused again, his voice dropping a shade lower. "Or to me." Those last words hung heavier than the others. Emily's heart pounded, her voice suddenly fragile. "Why me, Logan?" His eyes didn't waver. "Because you're unlike anyone I've ever met." Her breath came in small, careful exhales. "You could have fired me and avoided all the trouble." He shook his head. "I don't discard people who fight for others when they have nothing left for themselves." Emily swallowed, the knot in her throat tightening. "You're not like the people I've spent my life surrounded by," he continued. "They negotiate every act of kindness. You don't. You simply give." Her voice trembled, almost afraid to ask. "And that confuses you?" He allowed himself a faint smile. "It terrifies me." Their eyes locked again, this time longer, deeper. No pretense. No walls. "Because people like you," Logan exhaled slowly, "people like you remind me how empty my world has been." The waiter returned briefly with wine, breaking the moment. But neither touched their glasses. Emily finally found her voice again, small but steady. "I never imagined you even noticed me." "I've noticed you," he said softly. "Longer than I should have." The confession hit her like a quiet thunderclap, not loud, but shaking everything beneath her feet. "You're the first person in years," he continued, "who's made me feel like I want to be better." Emily felt something warm bloom in her chest, fragile but undeniable. "But I don't belong in your world," she whispered. Logan leaned forward slightly, his voice like a secret only meant for her. "You belong wherever you choose to stand." Her heart raced. This was no longer about work. No longer about power or even gratitude. This was something neither of them had wanted to name. Something real. When dinner ended, Logan stood and gently helped her from the table. As they reached the restaurant's front entrance, the car already waiting at the curb, Emily hesitated. The soft rain from earlier had left the street glistening beneath the city lights. Chicago hummed around them, but here, in this small pocket of quiet, it felt like the world had paused. Logan opened the door but didn't immediately step aside. His voice lowered once more. "I know you're afraid, Emily." She swallowed. "I don't want to make mistakes." "Neither do I." Their eyes met, that unspoken current pulsing again, dangerous and electric. "But," he added softly, "for the first time in my life, I want to risk it." Emily's breath trembled in her chest. And then, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "Me too." As the door closed behind her and the car pulled away, Logan remained standing beneath the awning for several minutes, staring after her, letting the rain cool his skin. And in that quiet space, alone for the first time all night, he allowed himself to admit what he had tried so long to deny. He didn't just care for her. He was falling. Chapter 7. Crossing lines. The office no longer felt like the safe routine Emily had once known. The glances were different now. The whispers quieter, but heavier. The casual greetings from coworkers felt tinged with curiosity, suspicion, and something else Emily couldn't quite name. She wasn't invisible anymore. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. But the real shift wasn't in the hallways. It was in him. Since that dinner, Logan had changed. Subtly at first, longer glances in meetings, softer questions during briefings. He called her into his office more often now, sometimes for legitimate projects, sometimes for reasons she wasn't entirely sure of. And each time it became harder to pretend she didn't feel the pull between them. One morning, as she entered his office for another project review, she found him standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city like he always did. Only this time his voice was different. Low, almost contemplative. "Do you ever wonder," Logan said without turning, "how easily a single choice changes everything?" Emily hesitated by the door. "Every day." He turned then, eyes meeting hers. There was something searching in his gaze, as though he was asking a question far beyond her work performance. "I didn't call you here for reports today." Her breath caught. He walked slowly around his desk, his tone steady, but far softer than usual. "I want you to join the executive development meetings, starting this quarter." Emily's eyes widened. Logan, I'm not ready for that." "You are." "I've only been here a year." "You've earned it." The way he said it left no room for argument, no room for modesty, no room for the self-doubt she kept wrapped around her like armor. "You see things others don't," he added. "You understand people. You understand risk. And you know how to lead even when no one's watching." Her pulse pounded. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes softened. "Because I want to see what happens when you finally start seeing what you're capable of." The weeks that followed were unlike any she had known. Suddenly, Emily was sitting in boardrooms with department heads and division leaders. She contributed quietly at first, but gradually her voice grew stronger. The more Logan called on her, the more the others started listening. And every time she spoke, she could feel his eyes on her, not in judgment, but in quiet, almost protective encouragement. It terrified her how natural it started to feel. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the skyline, Emily was wrapping up her notes when she heard the now familiar buzz of her work phone. "Logan, coffee? Now." Her heart skipped. She gathered her things and made her way to the executive cafe where Logan was already waiting at a corner table. Quiet, secluded. She sat across from him, trying to hide how fast her pulse was racing. "Black coffee, no sugar," he said, sliding a cup toward her before she could even speak. "I pay attention." Emily smirked despite herself. "Apparently you do." They sat in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. Finally, Logan leaned forward, his voice lower than usual. "I know you've been avoiding something." She met his gaze carefully. "What's that?" He studied her for a long moment. "Us." The word landed like a strike in the middle of the table. She inhaled sharply, her voice suddenly small. "Logan." "I've respected the boundaries," he continued. "I haven't crossed them without your lead." She looked down into her coffee, hands tightening slightly around the warm cup. "I've never allowed myself to feel this way for anyone in my professional life," Logan admitted. "But I'm tired of pretending this isn't real." The weight of his words pulled something loose inside her, something she had tried to keep hidden for far too long. "Logan." Her voice broke. "You're my boss." "I know." His voice was gentle but steady. "And yet here we are." She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "It's dangerous." "So is holding your breath forever." His eyes locked on hers, unwavering, pulling her into him without even moving an inch. "You feel it too, Emily," he said softly. "I know you do." The silence between them thickened, charged and electric. She swallowed, her voice fragile. "What if it doesn't work?" Logan leaned in slightly, his words softer than a whisper now. "But what if it does?" The cafe was quieter than usual as they sat there, two people suspended on the edge of something neither of them fully understood, but both knew they could no longer deny. Finally, after what felt like years trapped inside seconds, Emily forced out a breathless smile and whispered, "I'm scared." Logan smiled back, his voice the most human she had ever heard it. "So am I." Later that night, Emily lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city lights blinked faintly through her curtains. She had crossed a line today. They both had. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 8. Scandal Exposed. The morning started like any other. Quiet, controlled, routine. Emily arrived at Miller Enterprises at 7:45 sharp, as always, hoping, praying that her pulse would finally stop racing every time she stepped into the building. But ever since that conversation with Logan in the cafe, every moment between them felt like walking along a razor's edge. They hadn't spoken about it again, but the shift was there. In every glance, every lingering silence, every time he passed her desk a little slower than necessary. They were both pretending. For now. But the world had already begun to notice. By mid-morning, the tension in the office was different, thicker somehow. Conversations hushed the moment she entered the room. Faces turned just slightly away when she passed. At first, she told herself it was in her head, until she passed by one of the analyst's desks and caught a glimpse of his computer screen. An open tab. Breaking. CEO of Miller Enterprises spotted having intimate dinner with junior employee. Emily stopped breathing for a full second. Her picture, blurry but unmistakably her, stepping out of the Madison room weeks ago, Logan close behind. Her stomach dropped. The analyst noticed her staring and quickly minimized the screen, but it was too late. The secret, the delicate, dangerous thing they had both kept sealed, was now loose. The elevator ride up to the 35th floor felt endless. When she entered Logan's office, the door automatically shut behind her, leaving her in the heavy silence. He was waiting. His sleeves were rolled slightly, his jacket draped over a nearby chair, but his face was unreadable, calm, distant, controlled in that way only Logan Miller could manage. "So," Emily whispered, trying to steady her breath, "it's out." "Do you know who leaked it?" "I don't care." The words stopped her cold. Her voice trembled slightly. "You don't care?" Logan looked at her then, fully, directly, and for the first time since all of this began, she saw the depth of his resolve, the full weight of who he was when he truly committed to something. "I care about many things, Emily," he said, his voice steady and quiet. "The company, the board, the public, the stock price." Then he took a slow step closer. "But I don't care more than I care about you." The words hit her chest like a silent explosion. She wanted to believe him, needed to, but the fear inside her tightened its grip. "They'll say I used you, that I was climbing," she whispered the words like a confession. "They'll say whatever they want," Logan replied softly, brushing his fingers lightly against hers. "But we know what this is." Her hands shook, and for a moment she let herself lean into the warmth of his touch, terrified and comforted all at once. "But what if this ruins everything?" she whispered. "Your reputation, the company?" His voice dropped even lower. "Emily," he breathed, "I've built a life of control, calculations, power, but none of it means anything if I lose the one thing that finally feels real." Her heart caught in her throat. The storm outside the office spread fast. Headlines, gossip, endless speculations whispered in boardrooms and media outlets. The board called an emergency meeting. HR sent out polite but loaded inquiries. For days, Emily walked through the halls like a ghost. Eyes followed her everywhere, some with judgment, others with curiosity, but none with sympathy. And through it all, Logan stood as he always had, cold, unyielding, and entirely unbothered. Except when they were alone. Behind closed doors, his guard slipped, just slightly, enough for her to see the weight he carried, the tension in his shoulders, the battle raging behind his calm expression. "Let me resign," Emily whispered one night in his office, the fear finally breaking her resolve. "I'll leave quietly. The story will die." He looked at her like she had just suggested cutting off his own hand. "No, you can't protect me forever." "Yes, I can." "Logan." "Emily." His voice cracked slightly this time. "Don't make me watch you walk away." The air between them vibrated with everything they hadn't said yet, with everything they were still too afraid to admit fully. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. The words made her chest ache. "I don't want to lose you either," she breathed back. But outside, the world wasn't finished with them. The rumors grew louder, more articles surfaced. A minor shareholder filed a formal complaint. accusing Logan of violating the company's ethics policy. And suddenly, their private war became public. On the day of the board hearing, Emily sat alone in the corner of the conference room as the members filed in one by one, their faces tight, their eyes heavy with judgment. Logan entered last. He didn't sit, he stood at the head of the long table, his presence filling the room like a storm front. One board member, an older man with cold, calculating eyes, spoke first. "Mr. Miller, this relationship, however consensual, puts the company at great risk. The media is having a field day. The shareholders are nervous. The board is concerned." Logan listened quietly. Another member added, "We are not questioning your leadership or your ability to run this company, but your personal entanglements have created unnecessary complications." At last, Logan spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it was fire. "I've led this company to record growth for years. I've made shareholders wealthier than any of you could have predicted. I've protected this company through hostile takeovers, global crises, and market collapses." He paused, letting his words settle. "But let me be clear," he continued. "My personal life will not dictate my ability to lead, nor will it be weaponized to destroy someone who has done nothing but serve this company with integrity and loyalty." The room went still. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Logan's voice lowered even further. "If the board wishes to remove me, you may vote. But know this, if I step down, the company will fracture. My team will leave. My contracts will follow." He let the threat linger, sharp as glass. "And if your concern is my relationship with Miss Carter," he glanced briefly toward Emily, his gaze steady and unapologetic, "then I suggest you all consider that perhaps, for once, this company has benefited not from scandal, but from something rare." He paused again, his voice softening with rare honesty. "From loyalty, from trust, and from love." The word hung heavy in the air. No one dared speak. The hearing ended without a vote. That night, as they left the building together for the first time, Logan didn't say anything at first. The cold wind cut through the city's streets, but Emily barely felt it, as they stood beneath the street lamp. Finally, she whispered, "You said it." He smiled softly. "I meant it." Her voice trembled. "So did I." And for the first time, there was nothing left between them to hide. Chapter 9. Standing before the world. The city felt different now. Colder, perhaps, not in temperature, but in weight, as if every shadow carried a whisper, every glance held a silent question. Is that her? Is she the one? Emily walked through the lobby of Miller Enterprises with her head held a little higher than usual, not out of pride, but out of sheer survival. She had learned in the last few weeks that sometimes the only defense against the world's judgment was simple dignity. The headlines had cooled, but the rumors inside the company still pulsed like a second heartbeat. She could feel them. The curious stares, the careful silences, the fake smiles. But what mattered most was that Logan never wavered. Not once. If anything, he had only become more present, more visible beside her. And that, more than anything, had terrified the people who wished this entire scandal would quietly disappear. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. A formal gala. Miller Enterprises' annual investor summit. Black tie, full media coverage, the highest profile event of the year, attendance mandatory for executives, and this year, for her. The unspoken message was clear. This was no longer a private matter. Logan was choosing to stand before the world with her. The night of the gala, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, casting soft gold light over the sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns. Photographers circled like vultures near the entrance, flashes illuminating every step. Emily stepped out of the town car, breath tight in her chest, the long silk gown flowing around her like waves of midnight. Her hands trembled for a moment, until she felt his. Logan's fingers wrapped gently around hers, grounding her. "You're not alone," he whispered, his voice low against the soft rush of camera shutters. She looked up at him, perfectly composed, tuxedoed, his expression unreadable to the world, but open only to her. "I know," she whispered back. They walked together into the grand hall, and the whispers began immediately. Throughout the evening, Logan led her through introductions with effortless command. Executives, investors, board members, journalists. Each handshake was firm, each exchange calculated. But no one dared question his presence, or hers. Emily smiled politely, her heart pounding beneath the surface of every polite conversation. She could feel the eyes scanning her, evaluating her worth, her legitimacy, her place beside him. But Logan never once let go of her hand. Every glance, every touch, every small gesture was deliberate. She's not a secret. She's not a scandal. She's mine. Later, as the gala began to wind down, Logan guided her onto one of the balconies that overlooked the city. The cold night air kissed her skin, but his coat wrapped gently around her shoulders as he stood behind her. For a few long moments, neither spoke. The city glittered below them, indifferent and constant. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I didn't think I could do this." Logan's voice was soft behind her ear. "You did." She exhaled, her breath visible in the cold. "I keep waiting for the moment where everything falls apart." He turned her gently to face him. "You've already lived through the worst, Emily. The only thing left is whether you'll allow yourself to stop surviving and finally start living." Her throat tightened. "I've spent so long being afraid," she admitted. "I know," he whispered. "So have I." At their eyes locked, and for the first time since this all began, Emily allowed herself to fully see the man in front of her. Not the CEO, not the power, not the status, just him. Logan Miller, the man who had fought for her, the man who had stood before his board, his company, and the world, not as her boss, but as something else entirely. As the man who loved her. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his touch feather-light. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke again. "I never planned for this." She smiled softly. "Neither did I. And yet," he continued, his voice thick with something raw and real, "standing here with you feels like the only thing that ever made sense." The world below them faded as she leaned into him, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared of how much I feel for you." His hand cupped her cheek. "Then let's be scared together." And when he kissed her, soft, slow, deliberate, it wasn't rushed or stolen or forbidden like the stolen moments that had come before. It was honest, unapologetic, free. As they pulled apart, Logan's voice was steady again. "This was never about surviving the scandal, Emily," he said. "This was about proving that some things are worth standing for, even in front of the entire world." Her eyes glistened beneath the city lights. "And what comes next?" she whispered. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Everything." Chapter 10. A proposal under city lights. The city skyline glittered like a blanket of stars pressed against glass. Up here, on the rooftop of the Sterling Grand Hotel, the world below seemed smaller, quieter somehow, as if this one moment belonged entirely to them. The wind tugged at Emily's dress as she stepped forward, her breath catching softly in the cold evening air. Logan stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, staring out over the city he had conquered piece by piece. And yet, tonight, he looked more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "Logan," she whispered, approaching slowly. He turned, and the sight of her made something in his chest tighten, like it always did, like it always would. She was breathtaking, standing beneath the soft glow of the rooftop lights, her dark hair lifting gently in the wind, eyes reflecting both fear and something even more dangerous. "Hope. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice trembling as she crossed the distance between them. "Why?" His voice stayed low, steady, but his eyes searched hers. "Because everything about you, about this, still scares me," she confessed, her heart pounding harder than it had even on the worst days. "I don't know if I'll ever stop being afraid of losing it." Logan stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth against the chill. "Emily." His voice softened. "The only thing we should fear is not choosing to fight for it." Her eyes glistened. I don't want to lose you. In the back of the oyer big. Then don't, he whispered. He paused, exhaling slowly as if grounding himself for what was coming next. Then, without another word, Logan reached into the inside pocket of his tailored coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Not grand, not ostentatious, but simple and perfect. Emily gasped softly, covering her mouth as the realization hit her chest like a quiet, beautiful thunderstorm. Logan lowered himself to one knee, the man who once ruled entire boardrooms now kneeling before her, fully exposed, without armor. Emily Carter. His voice cracked slightly but never wavered. I never believed in fate. I never believed someone like me could deserve someone like you. She shook her head, tears already spilling, but he continued. But you've taught me what love is. You've taught me that strength isn't measured in what you build, but who you stand beside when life tries to tear it all down. His voice trembled with raw honesty. I don't want a world where I succeed without you in it. I don't want to win alone anymore. The ring glimmered beneath the rooftop lights, delicate, timeless. Will you marry me? For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them disappeared, and all that remained was the space between his heart and hers. Emily choked back the tears, her voice breaking as she whispered the only answer she'd ever truly wanted to give him. Yes. Logan exhaled, closing his eyes briefly as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. Then he stood, slipping the ring gently onto her trembling finger before pulling her into his arms. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't filled with hesitation or fear, only certainty. The skyline faded, the world hushed. It was just them now. Below them, life continued, the city humming with endless lights, endless noise, endless distractions. But up here, in this quiet space where two broken souls had finally found home in each other, none of that mattered anymore. Because against every odd, against every whispered doubt, against every fear they had once carried alone, they had chosen each other. And tonight was only the beginning, the quiet power of choosing each other. The church was small. Not because they couldn't afford something grand, Logan had offered every possible option, but because Emily had chosen this. Quiet, simple, intimate. Just as love had found them, not in opulence, but in the still places, where the world wasn't watching. The soft morning light poured through stained glass, painting warm colors across the aisle as Emily walked toward him, her hand gently wrapped around her bouquet, her breath slow and steady, her eyes never leaving his. Logan stood waiting at the altar, his usual composure softened by something far deeper. His sharp, calculating gaze now held only one thing: devotion. The man who once controlled everything now stood completely unguarded, his heart entirely in her hands. As the vows began, the world seemed to blur at the edges. Logan spoke first, his voice quieter than anyone expected for a man who commanded boardrooms. Emily, he smiled softly as his voice caught for a moment. Before you, my life was full, but not whole. I thought success meant never needing anyone. He paused, looking down briefly before raising his eyes to hers again, his voice tightening. And then you appeared, kneeling on a cold sidewalk, giving what little you had to people who could give you nothing back. And you taught me what it truly means to give, what it means to love without condition, without calculation. The room held its breath as his voice thickened. You were never part of my plan, Emily. You were my miracle. Tears filled her eyes as she gathered her breath to speak. Logan. I spent most of my life trying to survive quietly, afraid to ask for more, afraid that needing anyone would only bring pain. Her voice trembled slightly, but grew steadier with every word. You saw me before I believed I deserved to be seen. You stood beside me when I felt invisible. You fought for me when I didn't know how to fight for myself. She smiled through the tears now slipping down her cheeks. You've shown me that love isn't about being rescued, it's about finding someone who chooses you, over and over, even when the world is watching. When the officiant spoke the words, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Logan didn't hesitate. He pulled Emily into a kiss that spoke of every unspoken promise between them, not rushed, not desperate, but steady, certain, whole. Around them, their closest friends and family cheered softly, but neither heard the applause. The noise of the world faded again, as it always did whenever they were together. Months later, long after the headlines had quieted and the world had moved on, Emily sat on the small balcony of their Chicago penthouse, curled beneath Logan's arm as they looked out over the same skyline where their story had unfolded. The city still pulsed with ambition, with power, with people chasing what they thought they needed. But for them, here, there was only peace. Logan pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head and whispered, "You still scare me sometimes." Emily smiled. "Why?" "Because you remind me every day how much I have to lose and how lucky I am to have found it." She looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet light. "That's the thing about love," she whispered. "You don't find it by chasing it. You find it when you least expect it. When you're simply trying to give the best of yourself, even when no one is looking." He smiled, brushing his hand gently along her cheek. "And when you find it, you never let go." And beneath the stars, above the city that had once tried to pull them apart, Logan and Emily held each other, not out of fear, but out of choice. Because in the end, the real power wasn't in the money. It wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't even at survival. It was in choosing each other, quietly, completely, and forever. Sometimes, love arrives not to rescue you, but to stand beside you while you rescue yourself. And the right person won't be the one who saves you from the world, but the one who never leaves your side while you face it.